What's your story? It's a question that is my all-time favorite when I'm in a setting where I'm meeting new people. Now, you've obviously got to be careful about your tone. Saying something like, well, what's your story? May not be received quite as well. But when you ask it in a genuine manner, it opens the door for the story the other person wants to share in the way they'd like to share it, other than the traditional tired question of, so what do you do? Welcome to the Catalyst Health, Wellness, and Performance Coaching Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Brad Cooper of the Catalyst Coaching Institute. I'm really looking forward to today's discussion. Our story, the narrative we tell ourselves about ourselves, plays a critical role in the way we live our lives, the journey we're willing to explore, and our interpretation of what happens along the way. Today's guest, Lisa Russell, will be our guide on preparing for that journey. Lisa is a trained Storywork Counselor who specializes in narrative-focused trauma care and bringing a message of living into our true selves and breaking free from false narratives. She's seen that once we become aware of the narrative of our lives, it shines light on our current lens of how we see ourselves and the world around us. Lisa is one of our featured speakers at this year's Rocky Mountain Coaching Retreat and Symposium in Estes Park, Colorado, and we were thrilled when she agreed to also join us on the podcast. Speaking of the retreat, if you're a coach and you're not yet registered for the retreat, it's September 16th to the 18th in Estes Park, Colorado. Please don't wait. It is the event of the year for health and wellness coaches, and this thing's going to fill early, really early. All the details, including early registration and group discounts, you can find those under the retreat tab at catalystcoachinginstitute.com, or email us anytime if you have questions or you want to talk about a large group from your company, that kind of thing. Results at catalystcoachinginstitute.com. Now, it's time to explore our story on the journey to be a catalyst with Lisa Russell on the latest episode of the Catalyst Health, Wellness, and Performance Coaching Podcast. Lisa Russell, super excited to have you join us today, talking about what's your story. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm so honored to be here with you. It's nice to meet you.
I think people are going to be incredibly intrigued by this, and I'm hoping it's the beginning of a special journey for them. So let's jump into this. Why is our personal narrative of our life up to this point, wherever we are at this point, why is it so important to the story that we live out from this point?
It's so important. I think it's one of the crucial things that we need to look at. And how I describe it usually is we need to be able to look in the rear view lens in order to know where we've been, what we've been through, in order to see our present day lens clearly. Because our past influences our present and our future. And so what I've really noticed, not to kind of go on a rabbit trail here, but I see a lot of like toxic positivity, like, oh, that's in the past. We shouldn't, it's done. Let's just move forward. But we don't know how to move forward. And we can't even see clearly if we don't understand how our past narratives have impacted us.
Interesting. All right. So give us a starting point. How does someone tune into the story they're telling themselves? Because like you just said, there's toxic positivity. There's also the opposite of toxic negativity. We put too much stock in certain aspects. So how does someone in a not positive, like keep it positive, but in a positive manner, how do we tune into that story that we're telling ourselves?
Yeah, well, it's to go way back. So it's looking at some of the themes in our past and our stories that have reoccurred, or what we call reenacted over and over. So that is data for us. There's data when there's a reoccurring pattern or storyline that keeps happening over and over again.
And are there ways to tease that out a little bit more? I mean, obviously this is your skill set. So if someone's sitting there with you, you're going to be able to tease it out. But if someone's listening to this and they're saying, oh yeah, like are there certain, is it a journaling thing? Is it if you have old journals, going back and looking at those, is it talking to parents or siblings or friends that have known you for 20 years? Like, what are some of the steps we can take to do what you're talking about?
Yeah, really practically is what you're asking. Huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, so good. That's a great question. You know, I am such a big proponent of self-reflection and journaling. But when I think about story work, which is I'm a Storywork Counselor, which just means that we're looking at the narratives of our lives. I actually think writing out a story is very helpful. So it's actually digging into a scene, one scene in your story. So you don't have to write out your whole life story, but it's one scene in your story that holds a lot of data that could actually help surface what the reenactment has been over the course of our lives. Can I give you an example?
Yeah, that'd be good.
Yeah. Okay. So, when we think of our stories, there's always trauma. And I know that sounds dramatic, but we all have trauma in our past. And it can be a whole spectrum. I call it the little t trauma to capital T trauma, right? So if we're thinking on a scale of 1 to 10, this is probably more of like a 3 for me in my narrative. But in 4th grade, I had a friend that lived around the corner from me. And she had brought birthday invitations to school one day, and every girl in our class got a birthday invitation except me and one other girl. And I was just waiting for it like all day, right? And I could see the invitation. I knew she was having a party. I thought we were friends. We would play together after school. We even had overnights and, stuff. So we were connected. So I was so surprised and devastated as a little girl, right? So when I got no invitation by the end of the day, I went home just in tears. And my mom, who's a mama bear, that's what she did. She called her mom and said, "Why didn't your daughter invite my daughter to her birthday party?" And I think it was a numbers thing and whatnot. But the next day I got an invitation written out on a notebook piece of paper that invited me to the party. Well, of course I didn't want to go now, right? I felt like the pity invite, how embarrassing. And my mom still made me go because she fought for it so hard with this other mom. And so I went and gave the present, but I could just tell that I wasn't really invited. I wasn't really wanted at that birthday party. And then, so that's one scene. That is a trauma story. But why would that make such a big deal in the rest of my story? Right. I know a lot of people, no pun intended, but that's such an elementary kind of version of trauma. But when I look at my present day and some of what has happened or reoccurred for me and where I feel the most pain in my being or in my heart is when I feel uninvited. Mm. So, and social media hasn't helped, right? So when we're looking at Facebook or Instagram and I'm seeing, oh, those are all my girlfriends together at a night out. Why wasn't I invited? Yeah. Right. It's stirring something deeper in me, not just what's happening in the here and now, but it's actually triggering my 4th grade self. Right. So like my little 10-year-old girl is crying out to be tended to in some way, right? So, and then when I look at, okay, over the course of my life, that story has been reenacted over and over. Well, when we dig into that story, that specific scene, we can name at that moment, I made a vow. I made a vow that I am not going to trust girls, and I'm always going to have a ton of backup friends, because if Sarah didn't invite me to her birthday party, well, at least I have Becky, or at least I have Deidre, right? And so that's what I did in order to cope, right? I made a vow to just keep girls at an arm's distance and make sure I have enough backup friends, right? Which actually just perpetuates my problem. Right. So that when a group of girls today in my 30s gets together, they're like, well, she's okay. She has a million friends.
Right. Right. She didn't need to go. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So is the process working backwards? Do you identify something today that you say, I think this is an issue in my life, and then you go back and kind of search your story and think, oh, you know what? I bet that is correlated. Or do you the reverse way where you say, oh man, one of the things that stands out to me was 4th grade, this happened, and maybe that led, or is it both? Do you do both? How's the process work? Work backwards, work forward, a little of each?
Yeah, right. It's usually a case by case basis, but I would say predominantly it is, hey, this is what's surfacing in my life today. This is where I feel stuck. This is where I keep hitting that brick wall, right? And so then with a posture of curiosity, we go backwards. Where is this familiar? Where did this start? Give me a little bit more background on not just one of those trauma stories that sticks out, but what was the nature of your relationship with your family of origin? How did that impact or not impact your relationships today?
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Mm-hmm.
Have you noticed that certain ages, say the 5 to 10 year window or the 11 to 15 or the high school years or early 20, whatever, do they tend to play a more significant role in our story than other ages, or is it just all over the place? You've been doing this for a long time. So do you see patterns, or no, Brad, it's just everybody's different?
Yeah, I would say, obviously research shows that even really young babies, newborns, if they're not getting the attention and the skin to skin and the mirroring, right? So the looking at, the gazing at with delight, that impacts their development. So it goes back all the way to the womb and when you're born, for sure. But I would say, as I'm doing this work with people, we're really looking at, when we're thinking story work, we're looking at that 4 to 11 type of range of when did it start, right? And obviously you're going to see some reoccurring themes as they get older, but it's that 4 to 11 that helps us define, oh, this is how you were set up to become a person that was so hurt by not being invited to the birthday party, right? So it didn't just happen in 4th grade, but I was set up to be devastated about that. Where other personality types, they wouldn't even notice. They wouldn't even notice the invitations being handed out. But I was super hyper vigilant for a reason.
And so the step you take with that now, you obviously don't just say, so I guess that's just how I am. You're doing something with it. So as you look back at the young you and you say, hey, I can still see that happening today. Are you leaning in on, okay, you know what? I am going to get closer to 3 people instead of spreading everything out over 12 people. Well, like, what are the steps that you take based on that so that people can try to glean something for whatever story is popping into their head?
Yeah, such a great question. Yeah. So when we lean into curiosity and kind of figure out the why of who you are, why you have become that way, and how you've needed to either act a certain way or make those vows in order to survive. Again, I know that sounds kind of dramatic, but we all have coping mechanisms in ways that we've survived. Then when we name that, then we can learn to think through, what is the risk here, right? To say, I don't need 20 best friends. I can really commit to the 2 to 3 in my inner circle. And it feels risky and deep in my bones, deep in my body, right? Because of my story, that feels risky, because what if they decide they don't want to be friends with me anymore? I don't have a backup, right? But it's in that risk that develops transformation, right? So we're not just looking at the story to name all the harm and then wallow in the pit.
Right.
We're naming the story, right, and the harm to understand what are our triggers and how have we survived that wounding and those traumas in our life. And then what do we need to bless in order, or celebrate is another great word for it, of like how we've survived, right? There's something about like looking back at my younger self, and we all hold our younger selves in us, right? So my 4th grade self is still alive and active in me, right? So we can somewhat nurture these younger parts of ourselves by saying, you did a great job. You just really wanted to be loved and seen and invited. You just really wanted a best friend. And there's healing in there. There's something about the rewrite of those narratives that have kept us stuck. When we rewrite them, or what we call it restoration counseling, or restory, is that we're able to name like how we've survived, how we can celebrate those parts of ourselves, and also how we can find our own agency and advocacy by taking the risk. Does that make sense?
It does. And I like how we're not, I think the word you used was wallowing in it. What if I don't like the story though? So I identify something and I go back and I'm like, man, what was my problem back then? I know you would nix that right out of the gate. You'd be like, hey, wait a minute, there's some other stuff going on here. But no, let me re-ask that. What if I don't like where I've ended up? And I guess, frankly, that's why someone would consult you, is because there's something going on that we don't necessarily like the current narrative. So then what? I'm hearing you say you go back, you ponder that, and then you make some changes based on what you learned. Is that right?
Yeah, for sure. I think nobody really likes to go back into their stories of trauma. And yet I'm a firm believer we can't transform and we can't get to the other side of the trauma unless we enter in the heart of it, right? The pain of it. And it often, and I wouldn't even say often, it always involves shame. Because shame covers trauma and contempt covers shame. And so, yes, you are so right. I will nip that in the bud right away as soon as there's like any sort of contempt. And I have a motto that all my clients would say that I use often. It's compassion over contempt. If we can shift our posture with ourselves of compassion versus contempt, of the compassion of this is why you were the way you were. This is how you've had to survive it. So when we can go into the scenes of those stories and understand the why, it empowers, it actually surfaces and fosters a deeper level of compassion for ourselves.
There's so much to this. Thank you again for joining us. I love this. All right. So scope of practice. Obviously, it's very important for wellness coaches. We have a lot of health and wellness coaches listening. So yes. We need to make sure the coaches listening or the non-counselors listening are not trying to move into the realm of counseling. But what are some things a coach might notice that would alert them that the person might benefit in this area to seeing a counselor? Most coaches know when they feel like, we probably need to get you over to see a counselor. But in terms of the story piece, are there certain things that you would say, yeah, these are a couple flags that would alert you to this?
Yeah. Well, high levels of trauma for sure. Okay. Right. So whether that's acute, and I think it's good for every helping professional to know that there's acute trauma and there's also sustained trauma. And so we often give more, prevalence to the acute trauma, like I got raped, right? That is an acute trauma. But when you've had a sustained trauma of neglect with your parents over the years, even if it's not an extreme neglect, but they haven't met your emotional needs or provided proper containment for you, there's still a level of contained trauma there. Or sustained trauma, I should say. And so I think it's good for helping professionals to kind of know the spectrum of trauma and what one client would consider a 10 out of a 10 might be a 2 out of 10. So it's being really aware of body language, where you're feeling like they're almost stuck on a hamster wheel, right? Where they're just getting triggered into their wounds, into survival, and then they just stay in that hamster wheel, versus any movement and growth. Okay. That probably is then out of their scope, and they probably need to be referred to some professional, whether it's a Storywork counselor or a licensed professional counselor that can be a little bit more clinical on that end.
Okay, very good.
Can I add just something else to that? I think
absolutely.
It's really important for all helping professionals to know your own trauma, to know your own story.
It's huge. Right? Yeah.
And the reason is this: we are unable to take people farther than we're willing to go ourselves. So if you're coaching and you're wanting people to feel empowered and have advocacy, where are you at with that, right? How have you healed from your wounds? Where do you see the trauma getting reenacted in your story over and over again? Where are you stuck? right? And it will never be fully free. We won't fully arrive necessarily on this
Oh,
earth.
I thought today was the day.
I know, me too. I wish. um, but the more that we're growing and learning, like we're able to take our clients so much farther if we're willing to do the work ourselves. Because it's also helping you name what is your own triggers and what is the countertransference going on as you're meeting with a client, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
yeah, I
important
like that.
to know that.
Well, and we talked beforehand. We're going to play with this with my story in some way, but I'm not sure how we're going to do that yet. But you brought up a different question. So the parents thing. So there are obviously parents that are terrible people. Like they are abusive. They are, cutting their kids down. There are a certain percentage of parents that are just terrible parents or people. But the majority of parents, not perfect, make mistakes, but doing their best. So how do you do, and I think I'm a good example of that. My folks, we've got our issues, as they would tell you, but they did their best. They were good parents. They did their best with what they had. And that's probably true of, 95% of parents. So we didn't do perfect with our 3 kids. I'm sure they could tell some crazy stories. But what do you do with that? As the person going back, you don't want to put the blame on your parents. They were doing in most cases, they were doing their best. And yet, like, how do you work through that?
I know. And I don't know about you, but I am a perfect parent. So
well, I do know about me, and I'm definitely not a perfect parent. Ashley, Joshua, Danielle, you can vouch for that.
All right. I have already set up a therapy fund for my.
There you go. That's what we need to do.
I'm a counselor, right? Like I know these things, and I'm going to fail, right? Because that's humanity.
Right.
I'm a human and they're human,
totally.
Right? And so we trigger each other in different ways. But I think you're bringing up a good point, Brad. And let me just give a disclaimer to this. We all want to defend our parents, right? We all want to make sure that we're not throwing them under the bus, right?
Well, some people like to, but
that's true. There's a few out there, but I think we usually err on the side of protection, because when we protect our parents, then we also are protecting the younger parts of ourselves. So what I'm getting at is, even with parents that have intended to do well, have failed, they have created some sort of harm, right? And the truth is, our early learning of life comes from our family of origin. And so even going back to that 4 to 11 and just developmentally, you are watching what your parents are doing, not just what they're modeling, but how they're interacting with you. And so it sets you up for who you are. So we are, I like to think of it broken in thirds, right? We are a third nature, a third nurture, and a third free choice, free will. So we can't ignore the fact that, first of all, our nature comes from our ancestors, our parents, right? The DNA, but also the nurture of how they raised us. And that's for the good, the bad, and the ugly of it. And then we also have free choice and free will of how to respond to that, right? And so even with parents that have tried, they are still going to fail you. And there still is harm in general. And we have to name some of that harm, or the way that they've missed your heart, especially emotionally. I see this every day in the counseling room, where people come in all the time and say, I had the best upbringing. I grew up in a Christian home, and my parents were great, and they came to all my basketball games. And then when we really get into it, not always, but I would say the majority of the time, there was some sort of missing of emotional attunement, attuning into their heart, right? Where they had to figure out a way to survive it, something on their own, because their parents missed the mark, right? And not to go into too much detail, but just to give some categories for the parents out there, even as you're looking at your own narrative. The 3 main things that we need for secure attachment are containment, so healthy, age-appropriate boundaries. It will impact us negatively if we have too tight of boundaries or too wide of them, right? So age-appropriate, culturally appropriate boundaries. The second is uh, repair after rupture. So when something goes wrong, because we're bound to have some sort of conflict or argument in a home, was there repair afterwards? Were your parents able to say, hey, I overreacted there and I just want to say sorry, right? That actually is the number one way to form secure attachment is by being able to say you're sorry after a conflict. Because if they can trust there can be repair after some sort of rupture, whatever that rupture is, the more secure they are in the relationship. It's when there's no rupture. So that's often what I see. Oh, we had a great family. We never even fought. Nobody was even angry. And that is a huge red flag to me as a counselor, because that shows me you guys never had repair and anger wasn't allowed. Wow. Negative emotions weren't allowed in your home. So how does that impact you today?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the third category with developing that healthy, secure attachment is emotional attunement. So tuning into your heart. So when you had a bad day at school and you came home, how did they respond to that? Did they even notice?
And two parents in some homes. So let's talk to the folks that are fortunate to have those two parents for at least a significant portion of their life. Is it like one can, like, my wife, Susanna, she is so gifted. She tunes in so well to all these things. I miss it most of the time. Did that help our kids out to be like, well, dad's not even, he's like got blinders on in this area of my life, but mom gets it. Does that help make up? Do you cover each other? Is there some of this filling in the gaps, or, and by the same token, it was the other way with like, let's not put too much into this. I'd be like, okay, let's get back on the horse. Let's move forward. And Suze might be like, let's wait a little. So we were fortunate to have a pretty, I think, ask our kids, a pretty good balance between the two of us. Does that help, hinder? Do you need the same stuff from both parents? Like, how does that fit together? How do the puzzle pieces work?
Yeah, totally. Well, I would say you need all three of those categories from each parent. I mean, the more, the better. But if you're getting it from one of your caregivers, you're going to be set up for more success and be able to form healthy, secure attachments going forward. Okay. So I have a lot of clients that didn't actually get that from their parents, but they got that from their grandmother. So they knew and experienced what healthy, secure attachment looked like from their grandma. So then they were able to go and form secure, healthy attachments with other people, right? And it sounds like you and Susanna complemented each other really well.
We did. Yeah. We're so different. I've always had the theory that that's been good because between the two of us, we cover the gaps. Neither one of us, we both have a lot of gaps, but we seem to, I always call it the Rocky thing, where he and Adrian are dating and his buddy's like, you and Adrian, like, how does that work? Like, you guys are so different. And he very eloquently, the philosopher Rocky Balboa says, Adrian got gaps, I got gaps. Together, no gaps. And I've always joked about that in a serious way of Susanna got gaps, Brad got gaps. Together, not that we don't have gaps, but we really fill a lot of those gaps. So
no, it's beautiful. Yeah. Good job, Rocky.
Yeah. Thanks, Adrian. So that was really bad imitation. But anyway, okay. So now we have a massive part of the population that only has one parent. And maybe that parent is working two jobs and they can't, they're doing their best, but how does that parent, let's talk to the parents first. How does that parent more effectively meet at least some of those needs?
Right. Well, again, the posture with those three categories is key, right? So not once in there was it like 24/7. I have my eyes on this kiddo, right? Right. But there's an understanding there when you are with the kids, right? Okay, maybe you have to do an after school program, but you get them at night right before bed. Are you looking at their eyes and checking in on their hearts, right?
Yeah.
Do they have proper boundaries and containment when you are home and when you're not home, right? I mean, I was a latchkey kid for so much. I mean, most people in my generation were to some extent or another. And that's not to throw my parents under the bus. It's they were just doing the best they could, working full time, trying to make it. Right. And I still felt like even with that, we had certain rules and guidelines and people checking in on us, including my grandma, that could provide that proper containment. Right.
Okay. All right. Our memories are often ridiculously inaccurate compared to reality. There's been so much research on that. Is there anything I need to be careful of as I go through this process, knowing my mind might be constructing this story, but the reality is way over here? How do you approach that, knowing that even if I witness a crime of some sort 3 months ago, we're not talking 30 years ago or 50 years ago, we're talking 3 months ago, I still will miss a lot of important details or remember the wrong ones. And now we're going back 40 years, 50 years, 30 years. What do you do with that?
Yeah, I think a lot of people doubt their memory and their experience. One thing I really like to focus in on is our bodies and how our bodies hold the score. So it stores trauma and remembers things that our minds cannot. So if we're experiencing something and we're actually getting a visceral response, a somatic response in our bodies are trying to communicate or inform us of something that has happened, right? Simple example. I had a good friend. She was sexually abused by her father, and he held her down by her shoulder, her right shoulder. Awful. She didn't remember this, so it's not just was the memory accurate, but we often don't remember, especially high trauma. But another person went up behind my friend and tapped her on the shoulder, and she flipped back and had this reflex, and almost hit this one woman, right? Because there was something that was stored in her shoulder, right? And once she started engaging in story work, when she started digging into what has happened to her, she realized her shoulder was holding a memory that her mind had protected her against, So I know that's a hard story there, but it shines light on what our bodies can inform us of, right? And they often can be the ones that can bring clarity to the memory. And, what stirs up in us today, our experience, those reenactments also help give clarity of what had happened to us in the past. Oh, have I been reenacting this over and over again, right? It helps just bring the fog up from the memory. Does that answer your question?
It does. Let's rabbit trail that just a touch. So what I was trying to get to is what caution, maybe this is a better question. What cautions need to be in place knowing that our memories are not accurate? Or does it matter if we're able to resonate with maybe this is in some way, even if I'm wrong on this story, it's created who I am today because it's the way I remember it. It doesn't matter if it's what happened because it's what I remember.
You just nailed it.
Okay.
Yeah, you're still pulling out the patterns and the themes, right? And again, that's kind of what I was talking about body. Our bodies help inform us and confirm that in a lot of ways. Like if we're getting the relief from naming what the wound is and how you've had to survive that, there is something there, right? So I would say that more often we don't trust our memories enough. I would go the opposite of what you're saying, as we don't trust our memory, we don't trust our experience, and we don't trust our bodies.
Okay. Let's try this with me just on some, as you were talking about some things, I was like, well, what would be a good one? One of the things that popped in on what you were just saying a second ago is one of my tendencies most of my life has been to over-prepare. The silliest story is in college, I would retype all of my notes on and this is dating me a little bit, an old school typewriter. So literally I'd go to class, I'd write all this stuff down, and then I'd retype it all, or probably retype some sections of the book, which was a terrible use of time, frankly. It wasn't just more time. I could have used that time much more effectively, not just to enjoy life more, but to actually study more effectively. So, and that's kind of been the story of my life, whether it's endurance athletics, Ironman triathlons, marathons, that kind of stuff, overtraining, injured frequently, whether it was college of retyping notes. And I think part of my problem is in the back of my mind, I think, but every once in a while it pays off. I would not have an opportunity to be where I am today if I didn't do that, but maybe I could have done it with a little less. And I don't know what drove that. But so if you heard that, where would you go with that? Or am I on the wrong track on this?
No, that's great. I mean, the over-prepared and sounding like almost like you're thinking of worst case scenarios. So you got to go through everything and be overly prepared. There's something about protecting yourself.
Yeah. Well, let me pause there because I am not a detail person. So the worst case scenario thing, that's not me. It's more if I'm going to shoot the moon, I've got to work harder than anybody else here. That saying of you might be smarter than me, you might have more money, you might have a better background, but you will not outwork me. Like, I love that. That just stirs up within me. Yeah, that's right. And I don't know why.
Are you an Enneagram 3?
I am. Boom! She nailed it. Yeah. Susanna's walking me through I do not know the Enneagram like you and Suze do, but Susanna's been studying it a ton, and our whole family's been going through it as a result. So yes, I am a 3.
I mean, it's a helpful tool. And I just say that because you just sound so much like an Enneagram 3 that has to work so hard and be so effective, right? And why? What if you didn't? What if you didn't work as hard?
And I think, and I don't know what the spur has been for that, but I think that has started happening in the last 18 months or so. I don't know if Susanna and I just moved. I don't know if it's new phase of life, empty nesters. I finished a PhD, which had been a long-term goal. So I don't know why the shift, but I agree with you. I think you've nailed it. And I feel like that's not a thing like it was even 2 years ago. But I don't know what the story piece of that was. That's what I was curious.
Sure. Yeah. So if I were sitting down with you in my counseling room, I would start asking you a little bit about what success looked like for you and your family. Like, what was the messaging around
growing up?
Yeah, growing up, doing well versus failing. What was the messaging there for you?
Hard work was definitely a part of life. We mowed lawns when we were 12. We delivered papers when we were 7. I mean, it was certainly a part of life, but that's not unique to me. A lot of my peers would have been the same. Dad worked long hours, so maybe modeling that in some ways. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah. Do you feel like you needed to produce or perform in order to feel loved and attuned to?
I felt loved, the attuned to maybe, because I also had a pattern where I'd do something that was kind of cool and then be like, okay, how can I up that another notch? And how can I, so do a triathlon. Okay, cool. Do an Ironman. Okay, cool. Qualify for the world championship. Okay, cool. But it was a very short term, and people say that all the time about big accomplishments. Like, it's the journey, it's once you cross that finish line, it's like, okay, cool. And now what's next? But it was always what's next. It was never sitting in that moment and saying, okay, yeah.
Was it ever good enough?
Again, I think I'm in a different phase now where I feel like I don't need to perform anymore. I don't know what's causing it to happen, but I like it. But up until the last couple of years, no, it was never good enough. It always needed to be, how do I take that up? Okay, so I've got 2 master's degrees. Let's get a PhD. Okay, I've done 3 times at the world championship. Let's go for that 4th. Let's win it. Let's, whatever it might be. Yeah, it was always, there's got to be that next thing. So yeah, but again, as I'm saying that out loud, it's not unique to me. That's kind of the high achievers mantra, if you will.
It is, yes. And so there's lots of people out there the same personality type as you. And there's a lot of people that are not in that mindset
at
all. Yeah, seriously. So I think how I would describe it. Well, first of all, I would stay curious on like what has been the shift for you in the last couple of years. If you felt like something about the PhD or getting your kids off and married and empty nesters and settling into your new home has like somehow given you a settledness or a rootedness, and what would make that different now than in the past. Okay. So that would be some prompts I would probably leave you with, but also just to give some framework of like, we all have this true self and false self nature. So in your true self, it sounds to me, Brad, that you are a highly effective person who is very accomplished, who has a lot of drive, who has a strong work ethic, has a major capacity, right? Unlike most people, a capacity for work and drive and getting things done and doing a great job at it. And then we have this false self nature. And our false self nature is always our true self, what I call our core glory.
Yeah.
It's using our core glory, but it's just tweaking or deforming it enough to where we feel somewhat enslaved or in a bind. And so that's what I would wonder with you of like, how has that core glory of who you are and your effectiveness and your major capacity but been turned or deformed enough to actually like tie you down and keep you enslaved. Yeah. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, that's really good. I like that. I like that. The last one I've got is with the prompts. You mentioned reflection. You mentioned journaling. Those can be helpful tools. What are some prompts that you might suggest for people that do want to walk away from this interview? And by the way, we'll have Lisa's contact info. So if you want to reach out to her, if you're in Colorado, you want to actually meet with her, she'd certainly love to hear from you. But for those that are saying, okay, I'd like to start this process, are there some prompts that would help get them started?
Yeah, I think a great prompt is to just start noticing where you feel stuck in your life right now. Like what areas do you feel stuck? And then I think a second prompt would be like, start to reflect on your narrative. I always like to talk about it from like a timeline or a story map, right? If we can do, and this is what Dr. Dan Allender, who has been significant in my training, often says, he talks about the 30,000 foot view. If we were flying over our lives, our narratives at a 30,000 foot view, what would you notice from up in the airplane looking down, right? What pillars stick out to you that were formative in why you have become the way you are? Not just who you are or what, but why have you become who you are now? And then it's just noticing how some of those pillars, and some good, but some hard, right? And that's really where walking through the pain of what's been stolen or marred, kind of like I talked about, taking that true self and just deforming it enough. How are we reclaiming those ways that our true self has been stolen, right? What are we doing to reclaim them? Yeah. Good.
Okay. That's a great takeaway. Anything else to leave people with?
You know, I think it's important, and just to reiterate, I know I've already said this, but we have to be able to celebrate the ways we've survived. And if your listeners can hear anything today, it's compassion over contempt. Like the more we have compassion on our stories and these younger parts of ourselves, and even with our present day selves and the ways that we're stuck, it makes us more palpable to transformation.
So good. Lisa, really appreciate it. This is great stuff. I'm sure people are going to come out of this like, oh my gosh, how do I find this woman? So thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it. We'll see you at the retreat in September and we'll go from there.
Okay. Sounds great. Thanks, Brad.
Now you can see why we're so excited to have Lisa speaking at the Rocky Mountain Coaching Retreat and Symposium, can't you? Thank you again, Lisa, and we will see you in September in Estes Park, Colorado. Thanks to you for tuning in to the #1 podcast for health and wellness coaching. If you've enjoyed the podcast, you might also enjoy what we call our weekly Catalyst 5. It's 5 bullet point tips, tricks, and words of encouragement that we've discovered have enhanced our own personal and professional lives. They come out every Tuesday. And it's a format that, frankly, you'll read through in 60 seconds, but we provided links. So if there are certain ones of those where you want to dig into some more depth, it's very easy to click those links and go further. The link to get that on a weekly basis is down below in the podcast description. Next week's episode is one of our all-time favorites. It's an interview with world-renowned author and speaker on the topic of motivational interviewing, Dr. Jonathan Fader. As always, feel free to reach out to us with any questions about your current or future coaching career, results@catalystcoachinginstitute.com, or you can tap into additional health, wellness, and performance resources on the website, catalystcoachinginstitute.com. Now it's time to be a catalyst. This is Dr. Brad Cooper of the Catalyst Coaching Institute. I'll speak with you soon on another episode of the Catalyst Health, Wellness, and Performance Coaching Podcast, or maybe over on the YouTube coaching channel.